All right, welcome back to Call Me Data. Good morning, Peter.
Hey, good morning, David. Welcome
Yes.
back. Hope hope everybody's ready for this next podcast, and hopefully we're getting better at this. And let's see how
All
this
right.
goes.
So I guess our topic today is foundations for AI success. So we talked a lot the last couple of podcasts about an AI and data strategy and
Yes.
the role that that plays in helping to ensure AI is successful. But as we were having that conversation, we realized there are a whole lot of other things that are necessary ingredients to be successful, right?
Right. I think there's a long list of ingredients that are really necessary to be truly successful. And again, I always go back. You and I have had I lose track of the number of conversations we've had amongst ourselves, amongst you and I, about what makes the company, how do they embrace this and make it successful? Because valid reasons. We want them to be successful because if they're successful, we're successful. And we kind of always dive into the psychology of a company on trying to move them forward along the journey to embrace it and use it, but do it the right way. And there's a million different
Yeah.
perspectives on how to
Yeah,
get there.
it's definitely a situation where there are so many different routes to success, but there's also a lot of routes to less than success. And I think the critical thing is,
Yes.
I called it necessary ingredients, but the truth is there's no recipe, there's no formula for this, and each company will
No.
find a slightly different route to success. Hopefully, they'll find their route to success, but we can talk about some of the things that one should think about as you're sort of plotting that out, right?
Right. No, I agree. And to me, a company has a personality, has a culture. Every organization has their own, vibe, their own culture, their way of doing things, just their overall personality and how
Yeah.
they approach solving problems. And I think some embrace change readily. And again, this is, I think, very similar to humans. Some of us embrace change readily. Some of us are happy doing certain things, happy for the challenges, and many of us are obstinate and refuse to change in spite of overwhelming evidence that change is actually
Yeah.
good for us. The same holds true
Yep.
for
Yep.
companies.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point. Given that companies have different cultures, they probably define success with AI differently. Like how should we define AI success? Like,
Well, let me ask a more fundamental question. Can they even define, if they saw success, would they be able to notice something was
right.
successful? Would and I think that's even more. So, again, you and I have had many discussions about, and then I want to bring up an article, interesting article I read
Good.
this week that I'd like to discuss. But you and I have um, discussed this, I think, many, many, many times about AI being different and not being like
Right.
regular technology. And I think there's obviously factions that believe one way, and then there's you and I believe something very different. And I want to kind of, just start with that, but bring up the
Yeah.
article, and then maybe we'll segue into that and just kind of go from there. And again, this is tidbits, things we talked about, things we've learned along our journey, and working with companies. And I don't know if there's really a right answer here. There's certainly an enormous amount of
Oh, yeah.
opinions, including ours. But but at least we'll provide insight. I think these are things that we've had to think about when speaking to people. So all we can do is relate them to the audience. And obviously, if you have questions,
Yeah.
please chime in. Recommendations, things, I always say that jump in into the chat and let's answer those
That's good. I
questions.
look, I don't want to gloss over the nugget of wisdom you just dropped on us, right? Which is if you can't recognize success, does it even count? Did you achieve it? So I think maybe, to elaborate on that, every organization that's pursuing AI needs to know why. They need to know what their goal is, and they need to make sure that they can recognize or measure the degree to which they're
Right,
succeeding. And if you're just doing it because, which, it's funny. A lot of people I think are considering doing it because they've read that they have to have an AI
right.
strategy or they're afraid their competitors are going to use AI. And if they don't stop and figure out what for, that could be a pretty bad outcome, right?
Right. Oh, 100%. I think, look, AI does one thing it should do one thing well, is it should really make you think about how you use technology in an
Yeah.
organization. And are you prepared to use something like this
Right.
effectively? And kind of now segue into, the article I read, which was an interesting take. It popped up in the journal in my feed, and I suddenly read it. And the author is an interesting, from a business school, I want to say in Europe someplace. And he had two articles, one he had written a number of years ago, and the AI one. And his whole perspective was that companies shouldn't have an AI strategy at this stage. that the vast majority of them are not prepared to do an AI strategy. And I agree with a lot of the tenets of the points that he made in the article. I think, he has a valid point. And again, we have discussed this with so many companies, and we've implored them. And you and I have been talking about data strategy and foundational stuff for a
Right.
year. And so it was interesting to see. So, what's your take on it, David? Do you think that's a fair perspective for a company to have?
It's interesting. I can see two threads to pull on that. One is maybe the simplest thread is I think that maybe things have changed in the last couple of years because I do agree that there were a lot of companies pre-generative AI that were pursuing AI and they just didn't have the technology or data foundations on which to build, right?
Right,
And so we all know we've
right.
swapped stories and we all know companies that have gone out and hired some number of data scientists, for example, only to find
Yep,
that the technical
yep,
platforms are missing, the data is not available, et cetera. And so, those ultimately became frustrated data scientists because they weren't actually doing data science,
right.
they were chasing data,
Right
right?
science.
So
Right.
so I can see the argument that maybe there is a maturity level with AI, but I also believe that the necessary maturity level has come down a lot with generative AI. The data
Right.
requirements haven't, but the technical proficiency is maybe different than it was a couple of years ago.
No, I agree. And he made it interesting. I thought it was an interesting point. Obviously, one worth debating. I don't agree wholeheartedly with you, can't because you're not going to escape the use of AI in an organization. But I want to be very clear. I want to make a dividing line. The use of tools with AI embedded is different than an AI strategy for an organization and using your own data. And I think that's where you kind of have
Yeah.
to differentiate a little bit because you don't want to be left behind. And what I mean by that, there are some incredible tools out there now that can really have a radical change on your bottom line. But that's different than implementing your own AI strategy and fine tuning your own models and using your own data at scale. That's a different
Yeah,
thing.
that's a really good point. I mean, and we can't, it's impossible to overemphasize the fact that people will be using AI tools in some way. I mean, there's the
Right.
old adage, it's the old fool with the tool adage, right? Which
As a
yeah,
still
and
full.
and today, I mean, the challenge is anybody with access to a web browser could potentially have access to an AI tool. And I personally
Right.
do not believe that it's ever going to be really practical for a company to say we're just going to block all access to AI tools because new URLs and new ways of
No.
accessing these tools are coming up constantly. And those tools are being embedded in tools that
Right.
in other applications and tools that we use every day. So like the
Right.
closing the door approach isn't really going to work. So let's
No.
go back to what you said. I think it's really interesting because, if you don't have an AI strategy, but people are using AI anyway, and let's, for the sake of argument, assume they'll find a way, then the question becomes, would you rather use AI without a strategy or use it with a strategy?
And the question is, how far do you take
Right.
that strategy for use versus building your own? And some of the work that we're doing, and I look at it, and he had a couple of other valid points. Not to off him completely, but about companies not having just good foundational data strategies, which you and I
Yeah.
have spoken about. But some of the projects that we're working on, we're making extensive use of some of the AI software development tools, and I see how much the process has radically
Yeah.
changed. When you and I were coming up through the ranks, starting out in software development, you sat there and you wrote code over, C code,
Yeah.
complex. Just it
Right.
took forever to do it. And now speaking to one of our developers, he writes a very sophisticated set of requirements. It's basically a detailed architectural specification,
Yeah.
highly detailed. So it's a different set of skills. It's very
Yeah.
verbose. It's I'm describing the problem in this kind of detail, how I want it solved, and then they'll use that to run it through one of the models and generate code. Now that saves countless man years
Yeah.
worth of
Yeah.
development. You don't want to not do that. You need to do that. That's going to make your business more efficient.
But the point is, it is a very different skill set. It's funny. I think back to my very
Right.
first coding job back in the dark ages, the
Hmm?
pre-internet era. doing mainframe
Yeah.
coding, and one of the best disciplines that we actually had to learn was we wrote detailed pseudocode before we ever wrote real code.
Right.
And I probably spent
Right.
3 times as much time on pseudocode, handwritten back in those days, as
Right.
I did actually creating the real code. But it gave one an
Yeah.
ability to really think hard about what the logic had to be, what the algorithm was, what the situations and scenarios were that you had to address. Um, it sounds like that's sort of coming back in as a skill set.
It is.
Yeah,
As he put it, it's like he's like, I'm actually doing real engineering work right now. Because coding to him wasn't engineering work. This was the engineering. This was the thinking through the problem. It was being clear about what I'm building. It wasn't the actual generation of code. And that's a different perspective. And I agree with it. Honestly, when we went and spoke about it at length, I'm like, that actually makes an enormous amount of sense. Um,
yeah,
but you know, it's different, and I don't want to deny a company, but like back to the foundations of an AI success in an organization. What are, because again, I don't agree with the article totally. I think there are
right,
definitely some holes there, but what are the foundations? And I think it really kind of, you have to have a high degree of, if you're a CEO, you have to have a high degree of self-awareness when it comes to your organization and instituting
yeah,
change, at least
yeah,
at this scale. Um, because I think you had brought up a point to me earlier today about a perspective on, is AI just another tech tool, or is it something much
right.
greater than that?
I mean, it's interesting. Let's circle back to the strategy really quickly, and I want to talk about the is AI different than other tools? But as you
Right,
were saying that last bit, I was also thinking that sometimes strategy is an intimidating word, right? I tend to, when I hear strategy, I
right.
see it with a capital S, and it's like this big complicated thing, and you spend a
Yep,
lot of time on it, and oh, yeah, like it's hard. Um, I think in a
yep,
way, sometimes thinking about it as a strategy maybe gets in the way because the whole point that we might start with is you just need a plan. You need to be intentional about it. You can't go stick your head in the sand and
right,
hope that no one starts using AI in your company because whether it's the coding
right.
exercises we talked about or personal productivity tools or other things, people will be using it. And so call it a strategy, call it a plan, call it an intention or an approach, but you need to figure out
Right.
and have a stated intention. And I think, also strategy sometimes maybe feels too rigid. And, it's something we've talked about is like this is
Mhm.
a learning curve for everybody. And it's your strategy or approach is going to
Right.
evolve over time. It's not going to be the same. So,
So you bring up a very valid point that when you said the organization has to learn its new technology, and I 100% agree with that. And so I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about this and how do you approach
right.
a client, and ultimately we kind of landed on was, and I think you and I've done this before. It's we know organizations are not prepared for the upheaval this is really going to cause the organization from terms of people and infrastructure and every aspect of the business. We think, you and I clearly think, and then you have to get an organization. You have to start lifting them up. You have to kind of baby
Yeah.
steps, I think, in a way, to get them accustomed to the tech. And we said we landed on eventually was, let's start with highly focused
Right.
POCs, because out of that, and you and I have said this a million times, they're highly illustrative of the shortcomings of your environment
Yes.
that you're working in. When they point out all the potential problems you're going to have, if you want, people problems, organizational problems, data problems, you name it, it points
Yeah.
out, done right, it points out everything, what's good, what's bad, all the
Yes.
good and the ugly, and what it really takes to be successful
And
at
it also
this.
highlights, to build on that list, it highlights the degree to which your business process may have to adapt to your use of AI, because that's, I know, something we talk about a lot
Right,
with our clients is, you don't simply automate and apply AI to your process and the process is unchanged. So,
right, right. And I think a lot of people think that. And this goes back to when you and I were speaking about this morning. What is AI?
right. Well, there's a question for you. But what it's not, and sometimes the easiest way to describe it is like what it's not. And in the context of the business processes we just talked about, it's not robotic process
Right.
automation. And I
No.
actually more and more I appreciate the name robotic process automation, because when I think robotic, especially using that as an adjective, I think of something very structured and deterministic and
Right.
rigid.
Rigid.
Yes. And robotic process
Right.
automation,
Right.
bots to streamline your business process, they were rigid, right? You streamlined the process the
Very.
way it existed largely, and you might make some minor alterations. And I think AI
Right.
is different. It is a um, potentially, especially as we look at things like agentic AI, it's a more flexible way of introducing automation into a business process. But it's also means that that process has to adapt to the way that AI works differently than robotic process automation.
Right.
So,
Right. Where if RPA, you change something, it
right.
breaks. With generative AI and AI, it
Yeah.
will adapt. And I think the difference is a lot of those older types of technologies were, and they were legitimately just they're good technologies. They solved a very specific problem. They were, in fact, very rigid. But whereas, AI, generative AI, to me, it's always been, I think, the approach I think we have told everybody to take is you have to heavily involve the business in doing this. This is not something that we think IT should own this process because there are so many business implications, process implications across the entire
Yeah.
firm, that you really have to pull everybody into it because for the first time ever you're going after knowledge worker. Take a step back. You're doing the jobs of
Right.
knowledge workers, which is something that's
Right.
very new.
Or maybe augmenting the jobs of knowledge workers. Right.
Right,
So let's use that
right.
as a good jumping off point to go back to your $64,000 question. I don't know, is $64,000 even an appropriate price for any question these days? It was once.
But you and I dating ourselves by
Yeah,
talking about that because I doubt anybody actually remembers that
and
game
now
show.
people only care about billions. So um, maybe the
Yeah,
$64
no,
billion dollar
sixty-four
question.
thousand dollars is the old
Yeah.
billion is the new
We need
sixty-four
to
thousand
update our
dollars.
yardstick. But the question about what is AI, and I think without trying to get into a definitional discussion, which we have had before and can certainly do again,
Right,
it it sort of revolves around where are all the places that it appears or can be applied, right? And so we talked about coding, personal productivity tools, um, chatbots and applications built on it, built
right.
into software and services that you buy from third parties. Like it's everywhere. Suddenly,
And I think right. Well, it is, and I think those are and I say those are the easy implementations. The harder ones, the ones where you have a very complicated business process or you're performing some kind of
yeah,
function. Let's use the I don't know, I'll say easy example. It's not really, but the study out there where doctors that are augmented with models perform better than doctors alone. So now you're going into types of jobs that obviously highly educated upper echelon type of areas. And the same thing exists in, obviously our background's heavily in finance, but taking some of those functions in finance, research generation, equity research generation, global research generation, whatever it is, it obviously is something that requires a lot of skills, a lot of education, a lot of historical knowledge. And you're now taking models to augment an analyst to do that role. So you could potentially take somebody who's junior and make them effectively equivalent to somebody who maybe has 30 years of experience out
right,
of the gate. And that's
right.
powerful. That's not something you're doing with just technology.
That and that's a powerful vision, and it sort of also loops back into the conversation about strategy, right? Which is that your goal? And you have to know that before
Right.
you start. Is my goal to replace existing processes? Is it to replace people, which I don't think is a great or necessarily even really achievable goal? Is it to augment
Right.
people's productivity in the office, or is it to augment their knowledge, like the example of doctors making diagnoses assisted by AI? Like those are
Right.
fundamental questions you have to understand. And then your point about that process is you don't just stick an AI bot in the middle of that process and say, good, now help this doctor, right? You have to fundamentally
Right.
understand what are the implicit steps in the process that a physician goes through and
Right.
figure out, often through experimentation, to your point about proofs of concept, where you can inject some intelligence with AI into that process and how that interaction model
Right.
between the human and the AI actually
Right.
works, because it is an interaction model. It's
Right.
not what's the answer and the AI gives you the answer and you're done. It is a back and forth
No.
interaction model.
Right. It changes. No, 100%. Exactly. It changes how you operate with a computer very dramatically because, like I said, it's a back and forth model. It can reason with you. You can ask it questions. It can respond. Um, Something I was going to say, I lost my train of thought on it, about these models. And I think, if you're an org and you're approaching this, and I'm not going to say approaching, every organization obviously has touched on artificial intelligence or they're using in some capacity, whether they know it or not,
Right.
it's being used. It's like, where do you start? I mean, again, the boil the ocean approach, have a global strategy, getting back to what we spoke about in the beginning, you need to push your org forward. And how do you do that? And I guess POCs is certainly one of them, but the one thing that you and I have spoken about, in fact, created a class about, is
Yeah.
educating the
Yeah.
organization and making sure they truly understand um, the tech. And I think a lot of orgs are reluctant to take that approach at
Yeah.
first.
I think you're 100% right. There is no escaping the fact that business leaders, to understand and identify where they will apply AI in their business, have to understand something about the technology. It doesn't mean they have to be complete experts and understand everything, but they have to understand something.
Right,
And, like I know it feels foreign to people, but if you think about it, that is no different than every other
right,
technological wave that has come in society, right? People didn't become factory foremen without understanding the basics of the machinery. That doesn't mean that they could repair every
right,
piece of machinery, but they had to understand something about their manufacturing practices. So I don't think
right.
it's unreasonable to say that a modern business executive needs to understand AI. And I say executive in a very broad, inclusive sense, right? It's anyone who's managing a team or anyone who's setting direction, whether your team is, 50,000 people or three. So,
Right. And I want to look. To me, it's again, it's another tool in the equation you want to use. And if I'm using a tool, I want to know how to use a tool and where to use that tool. And the more I know about
right,
that tool, the more I can look at a problem and say, you know what, that's a good problem for artificial intelligence, or it's not. That to me is the important thing. So now you have a lot of people looking at problems, and when they're approaching a problem or a process or whatever it may be, if they're educated about the capabilities, they're going to make different
right.
decisions. They're going to look at it with a different view than they would otherwise. Like maybe they'll take a completely different approach than they would if they had the knowledge of AI.
Yeah,
And I think that's why it's important to educate. And I think a lot of executives, or certainly and I don't know if they push back on it as much, but they don't look at it as a necessity. To me, training is technology training. I'll learn how to program a model, but that's
yeah,
not what we're talking about at
right.
the end of the day.
Right. It's bigger than that. It's an awareness training. It's a comprehension of what this technology is. And it's really important because, back to the question about how do you get started, you don't get started by just telling everyone to go experiment with AI, right? You get started by
Right,
carefully considering and choosing some key, inflection points or footholds or whatever you want to call them that you'll experiment with and start with.
right,
And it's because at the end of the day, your business strategy is your AI strategy, right? Your AI strategy has a lot more detail in it
right,
about how you're going to use AI,
right,
but it
right,
should mirror your business strategy. And yet all the
right.
time I see organizations that basically turn smart people loose on AI, but without having
Yes.
it tied to the business strategy. And
So you,
yeah,
no,
I
guys,
was going to
please,
say it's
please
a build
finish.
it and they will come approach, and they usually don't arrive.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely correct. They don't arrive because I think technology decoupled from the business. And it's so funny. The author that wrote the first article about AI strategy also wrote a number of years ago. And this is so spot on. And I don't know, I'm not fully appreciative as to why it's not in everybody's thought process. Um, Technology should not be separate from the business. And historically, and it goes back decades, tech at one point when I started out my career, we actually reported into the business. I sat my trading floor for a long time. I understood the business. In many cases, you understood the business better than the business people
Yeah.
because you had to implement it. So you had a real deep appreciation of what happened. And over time, that separated out, and tech became separate from the business, and it became a cost center. And most of it, and a lot of it, got outsourced. But most developers know nothing about the business that they're supporting, and they know very little. And I think that's problematic. And why is that problematic? Because you can't just throw this stuff over the
Yeah.
fence and say, go
Right.
implement AI.
And there will always be a job for people to um, build and implement technical infrastructure, right? The business people aren't going to implement
Right,
technical infrastructure, the same as your business people aren't going to maintain your fleet of trucks or airplanes or, whatever, right?
right.
But I think that line is finally starting to blur between business and technology, as it should. And you probably have seen
Should.
over the last couple of weeks, there's been a ton of discussion around something that the CEO of Anthropic said, which was by the end of the year, coding will be virtually extinct as a profession. And
Right.
that's interesting because, if it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where generating code with the assistance of AI is dependent primarily upon your ability to very clearly articulate a business process and
Right.
requirements. Where do you need the technical specialist for that? Hypothetically, and I'm not
Why
saying,
that's
every coder will
hypothetical.
be out of a job or anything, but it's as a thought argument, it's pretty interesting.
Well, and what it does is also it lowers the barrier. So if you're a sophisticated business user and you're relying upon a technology team that, is busy, is swamped, is doing other stuff, do it yourself.
Yeah,
If with the right set of tools, all of a sudden you have a business person who maybe has never written a line of code his entire life, but is very capable of writing a description of a problem,
right.
generating code and running it. Well, that changes things quite
Yeah, yeah, very
significantly.
much. And look, this started happening 30 years ago. This isn't new to AI, right? Um,
Right.
you and I probably
No.
remember the first time that Visual Basic was available inside Microsoft Excel. And suddenly people in the finance
Yeah.
department were basically creating end user applications inside of Excel. Um, right. So this is
Right.
not a
Right.
brand new thing.
Exactly. No.
Yeah.
No, I think the sophistication now is got you can create now far more sophisticated applications very, very faster. Um, but I want to touch on a couple of
And
things because
before we do, we
I
have
know
we
we're
have a
almost
question from the
halfway
chat.
through.
So,
Oh,
let's address that. The question is, how can I train my organization on new AI tools that I want to implement to improve workflow? It's a good question. uh, Here's where I would start. And Peter, you and I might have slightly different starting places, so I'll give an answer and you can jump in. I would start with
yeah,
it's not the most exciting thing, but I would start with some education on what consultants used to call the art of the possible. I'll call it here. It's more the art of what's actually realistic, and that means
right,
helping the organization to learn a little bit more nuance about what AI tools are capable of, what they do well and what they don't do well, and then
right.
helping them maybe even interactively explore the limits of where they are good and where they're less good, so that they can begin to get a sense for how they can fit into that workflow. Because it's almost never going to be the case that you take the existing workflow and just AIify it, right? You're going to have to figure out, okay,
Right.
here's the goal, here's the steps in the process. Some of these AI can do really well, some of these AI can't do it all, and some are AI with some degree of human intervention. And you want the business
Right.
to help be part of that discussion. So I think giving them some foundational education about what's really out there today is a good place to start.
It's
Where
helpful.
else? I'm sure you have other
So
suggestions.
you and I well, but that's a great start. I think. But the funny thing is, you and I have worked in finance for a good part of our career, and we've always had to do or read or perform educational
Yeah,
classes for regulatory
yeah,
reasons, nonetheless. But they consume up a fairly decent amount of time over the course of a year because you're required to do
yes,
I want to say dozens
yeah,
of them, but more
yep,
than we like doing for things that we've seen 1,000 times. I can't understand like why taking a 2-hour foundational class on artificial intelligence and deploying it to your organization, it should be something you do by default because it's going to have such a dramatic impact on your organization. I still think education is foundational to using this stuff
yeah,
properly and understanding its capabilities. And then over time, you identify a set of tools that you could integrate into your workflow to make your workflow a little bit easier, and you kind of go from over there. But so much of this to me is lifting up the organization and giving them appreciation of the power of tools and the capabilities
right.
of these models. That to me is so incredibly important. So, going back, what's the foundations of AI success? To me, a big part of it is, and we could look, every organization is different, obviously, and there is success for a company that is, really good about managing their infrastructure and their data very well versus success for somebody that's starting out with it. But to me, education is so important to getting this ball rolling and rolling
Yeah.
well, to start opening up people's awareness of the capabilities. And again, I don't mean simple stuff like, why, prompting a file, prompting a model. That's not what we're speaking about. It's, you kind of got to dive in a little bit deeper, go to the next thought. I'm peeling the onion a little bit more, show people what
Right.
can be done, so they can start thinking about it, integrating it into their day to day, and becoming aware of things. Wow, this maybe is a problem I could solve with a
So
model.
you just made me think of a really good analogy, or maybe not a good analogy. We'll see. But you're a woodworker. My dad was a woodworker. I
Oh
grew up
yes,
watching him and trying to help him in his wood shop.
yeah,
And what I realized is you're talking about education. Is imagine you have a carpenter from the 1950s, right? If you gave them a better
right,
hammer, so today you can buy a nice titanium hammer, right? If you gave the carpenter a titanium hammer instead of his wood handled steel hammer, he or she would still know what to
right,
do with it. But if you gave that
100%,
1950s carpenter a biscuit joiner, a modern piece of joinery equipment to create specialized joints between pieces of wood, they wouldn't know what to do with it
right,
until you showed them. And more importantly, not just how to use it, but where to use it. What kind
right,
of joints would be
right,
strong and what kind of joints would not be the appropriate place to apply it. So
right,
that's the important distinction where I would transfer that to AI is this isn't just another tool. This isn't just, okay, I'm giving you a new version of Excel or I'm giving you a new email tool. This is different than the tools
right,
most people have worked with. And so you need to go through that process of learning where to apply it as well as how to work it.
right.
So,
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think that's actually a interesting way of describing it, but
all
perfect,
right, I'm
so
going to
spot on.
copyright the
Because you're right.
biscuit joiner theory of AI.
We'll apply it for that one. I love that. But it's so true, though. I mean, you're absolutely correct. You take somebody from the 50s and you say, hey, they're not going to know what to do with it. I mean, they'll
Right,
figure it out. But again, taking somebody from, the 1980s version of Lotus 123 running on an old, TRS-80 Model 2 or something like that, and then, putting them in front of a modern Excel spreadsheet with AI capabilities and everything else, they're going to be
right.
completely
So
lost.
so going back to the question from the chat, if one agrees that education is a good place to start, how do you do that? What would you do? Especially if you didn't have a uh, large education budget or established program around education, how would you start that process?
It's a good question. I don't. Yeah, it depends on your organ.
Yeah,
It's a good question. Depends on your organization. And I don't. You look. I look at it as an investment, and I think most companies look at education as an investment in employees. I think this more so than other types of education, since it has such a profound impact. And even without an education budget, I think it's important for companies to find a way to perform some level of
yeah,
education for their employees and stop pulling them ahead. Again, this to me is technology. This, if you want to call it technology, is going to be so foundational to most organizations that the wait and see approach is not
right.
something that's going to
No, I
be
think you're right.
acceptable. Um,
If I were doing it on a shoestring, I think I would do a couple of things. I would first of all um, probably rely on some vendors and partners to bring in examples of tools, but I would really try to focus on how they work rather than just what they do. Right. The feature function part's interesting, but
right,
if you get into what's the underlying approach and how they work, that could be interesting. So you could
right,
probably get some, vendors or partners maybe doing some demos to give you some leg up on that. Um, I do
right.
think it's very important to spend a little bit of time on how the models work, right? And again, we've said this countless times. You don't need
Yes,
to go in and be a complete expert in it, but you need to understand the basics so that you can kind of
right,
predict where they're going to fit and where they're not. Um,
right.
and of course, you could always call us. That's a shameless plug.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll happily do it. Well, as I say on this one, but we'll happily do a day-long seminar on this for you. But it's to me, it's interesting because it touches on so many aspects of the business, and it's like a train running through the entire business. And if you don't know what this stuff is capable of, you're going to fall flat because
Yeah,
somebody else will. Somebody else is going to make full use out of it, and they're going to ultimately cause your business pain because they're going to be better at
right,
doing what than
right.
what you're doing because they understand how to apply the technology. I mean, I look at this, and again, I mean, it's not. I try not to use hyperbole. I've never been one to go over the top with all this stuff, and I am generally try to be very cautious about my predictions when it comes to this. But having been around for almost 40 years playing with tech, this is truly, I think, transformational, and you have to give it a lot of thought, and you've got to do a lot of organizational
Yeah,
self-reflection to get you there. Because if you're not embracing this, this is the first day of the day you're
yeah.
going to begin to die. I look at it that way, and you
Yeah,
have
no,
to.
I agree. It's, it's adapt or perish at some point. Follow-up question we had from the chat
Yeah.
is, would we ever consider creating a downloadable guide on how to train your organization on a simple AI tool like a company GPT or a company chatbot? Um, Really interesting idea. Uh, yeah,
Yeah,
I
interesting,
mean,
actually.
here's the challenging part, and not to make it all seem overcomplicated, but I don't think there's any one single pattern that works, but we could certainly put together some um, guideposts on the steps that you go through. I mean, it's largely dependent upon what kind of information in your company you want to use, how readily available that
Right.
information is, and what quality it is. There's some technical decisions, like I know people often start out using something like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, with a
Mm,
chatbot. But depending on your scale and your scope, that can either be really expensive or really cheap. So now you see things like
right.
context rag or graph rag, or right, and all of these have different
Right.
pros and cons. And then, Peter, you talk quite frequently about when to
Yep.
make the jump from something like RAG to fine tuning a model, which is yet another approach you can use. Um, so I think,
Right.
we could certainly,
Right.
it would be interesting to take a look at some of the potential architectures and steps and some sort of a decision tree about how you start to evaluate this.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. Another question I want to ask you, actually, because it kind of dawned on me. You're a new organization, you're starting out with the technology, or not starting out, your employees are using it, but they're using it without any kind of real guidance from the organization. What kind of person would you choose? And we've discussed this
Yeah.
before. Would you choose to lead this endeavor at an organization? And I have an opinion. I'm sure you have an opinion. I think they're the same, but I'd be curious to know what your thought is on
Am I
this.
allowed to say a unicorn? I want someone who is equally adept at technology and business. Uh, okay.
Yes, you are.
All right.
Well,
So it's
that's
the
basically what you
unicorn.
need.
Um, but assuming a unicorn is not available, um, yeah, it's a really good question, and I do think I hate to say it depends. It just feels like a cop out when I say it, but it does depend on the culture and current capabilities of the company. But here's what I think, and this is a question I used to get a lot when I was the chief data officer. People would say the equivalent question would be, should a CDO be on the business side of the organization or on the technology side of the organization? And I think over time I realized it doesn't matter. There are implications of either.
Right.
What is very clear is a CDO needs to have a pretty good degree of proficiency in technology and in the business. And I think the same
Right.
applies to an AI leader. They need to be technically proficient. That doesn't mean that they need to be a data scientist or a software engineer, but they need to understand AI. They need to understand data. They
Right.
need to understand transformation. They need to understand how to drive cultural change,
A
right?
unicorn.
And they need to understand the
Right. A
business.
unicorn.
So yeah, there is a little bit of a unicorn thing going on there. Now,
And you said something. You said something very interesting, though, and it's not interesting. I mean, you and I have lived this for a long time. Which side of the business should the CEO sit on, the business or the technology side? To me, with that question alone illustrates that there's a fundamental problem in how technology is just
right,
structured within an organization.
right,
Full stop. It shouldn't be here or there because as well as I do, many CIOs are layered. Or they don't report to the CEO. They're either
right.
laid under the CFO or the COO, which in and of itself, to me,
Yeah,
is a problem.
yeah. The fact that there's even a side, technical versus business, is probably an artifact that should go away in future organizations, right?
A CEO, especially in the 21st century, is so heavily reliant on technology and running their business. that if they're not deeply in the weeds and make an effort for themselves to understand how this stuff works, that you can't just outsource this to somebody else. I mean, you could try. I don't think that's a wise
Yeah,
approach, especially something like it says tech, which really will trickle up to the top in the board level and every
yeah,
place else. You need to have somebody who understands, I think at least, an appreciation, a CEO, at least CEO type level. But I think I agree with everything else you said regarding the person. You need somebody who understands minimally. I think the business appreciation for the business and the
yeah.
engineering side, or if not an engineering expert, but somebody like you said, very technical and understands how
Yeah.
this works.
Do you think that AI, as we're starting to see it applied to the software development process, is going to be the thing that enables real distributed application development, meaning business units and departments start creating applications and the IT department becomes more focused, as it used to be in the early days, more focused on building, operating, and protecting that technology infrastructure?
I think I agree up
Yeah.
until a point. I think what's going to happen is you're right. I think you're going to see parts of your organization writing their own specifications and deploying their own code. So you'll get somebody who is not viewed as an engineer, a non-technical person, has a problem, wants to solve the problem, will write a outline of the problem, will generate code, deploy the code, whatever they have to do. I think in the beginning, you and I have always seen with these new technologies is the IT department makes a land grab. They're trying to prevent that from happening because they're losing their ability to control the world. And I think
Yeah.
that's gonna that barrier has to come down because that's not. I don't think that's gonna. That's not a
Right.
sustainable strategy, especially not with this. That might have worked with other technologies, but it's certainly not going
Yeah.
to
And
work
to
with
be clear,
this. And I think they have to
that
embrace it.
land grab often originally had some very good reasons behind it, right? Like I've seen cases where
Yeah.
organizations have somewhat mission critical systems that are actually running in a closet somewhere on a home built system, and there's huge risk
Oh,
around
yeah.
that, right?
So by
but
right.
but it's interesting because
Yeah.
end user computing is a phrase that still makes a lot of CIOs see red, and I meet people all the
Right.
time whose job is to root out and destroy EUC solutions, end user computing, and that is bring them under
I know.
control of the IT department. But now we've been talking for years about citizen data scientists. So will we have
Right.
citizen developed applications? And that's not to say every application, right? Like your your heritage is
No.
building very complex high-speed trading applications. That's always going to be a specialized
Right.
job.
Right. You're not doing that
Right.
with AI today, and not even for any
Right.
time soon. Um, but there are a class of problems that are solvable and should be solved
Yeah.
by end users. And I think, it's funny. It goes back to the personality, I think, of a lot of the IT organizations and where you and I were living for many years. They're highly risk
Yeah.
averse.
Yes. And the other interesting part about it is I think we, as humans, we tend to focus on the outliers, right? So that trading application or a telephone switching application, those are very complex beasts. I think back to several jobs I've had at different companies where, we've done things like looking at a cloud migration, and you start with a list of
Right.
6 or 8 thousand applications, and then you realize that the vast majority of them are relatively small applications that have low performance requirements. Some of
Right.
them are only used on a sporadic basis. So it's the Pareto principle amplified, which is, you've got a
Right.
fraction of that 6,000 that are the really complex mission critical applications, but the rest of them are essential, but they're a lot simpler in a number of ways. And so,
Right.
there is that. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of a citizen developed application for some of those things.
So do I. And look, it makes sense. It lets the business do what they want to do without having to rely on an IT budget to do a lot of this work all the time. So, but I think, going back to the very beginning and just if I'm to summarize a lot
Yeah.
of what you and I are saying here, it really requires you having a very close, again, self-awareness of your organization and how do you institute change. The change is happening. It's going to happen. I don't think you're going to stop this train from coming down the tracks and if impacting your business. You have to figure out how to embrace it, use it, and maximize it and as I very often say, sometimes you have to rebuild the 747 while it's still in the air. You kind of have to do
Right.
that to a certain degree, only because this tech is, at least I think, incredibly powerful, and you have to be ready
Yeah.
for it. because it's
Yeah, no,
happening.
I agree. I think, you can't hide from it. You have to embrace it. You have to anticipate it. And so, to me, going back to the article you read, I guess I would come down on the side of you need a strategy. Don't be afraid of a capital S strategy. Don't make it overcomplicated, but don't ignore it.
Right,
Have a plan. Be intentional. Set some intentions and work towards them.
right.
Um, right. And that strategy has to
Oh,
feature education as a
so
big component.
and I was just going to ask you that, like that part of the strategy, because a lot of these strategies come out of technology, which I don't think is the answer. Where would you, when fomenting or creating a strategy at the corporate, who would you involve in that?
I would want an AI leader to view themselves as a facilitator, but to have that strategy be generated by and articulated by the business leadership with coaching and support and teaching from an AI leader. But if the business doesn't look at that strategy and recognize their own words, their own priorities, and their own objectives in it, it's too disassociated from their business and it won't work.
I agree. I agree. I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. I think always my concern with these types of strategy documents is, the company will say, "Oh, I'll bring in another third party consulting firm who will write my strategy for me," and they'll dump hire one of the expensive strategy consulting firms out there, and they'll drop a deck on the desk and say, "Okay, here's your strategy." Nobody's been involved in the creation of the strategy. It's a cookie cutter approach where I think, especially with this, every organization is unique, just like every individual is unique. You have to take a close look at yourself or the org and involve, like you said, involve other parts of the business. And I think almost like the person that's leading it, not only,
Yeah.
obviously needs to understand AI and needs to understand technology, also needs to, I say somewhat tongue in cheek, you need a PhD in
Yes.
psychology because you're changing an
Absolutely.
organization.
So you can't outsource your strategy. You just can't hire someone to write it for you. You can
No.
hire people to help you facilitate the collection of ideas and
Yes.
formulation into a strategy. You can hire people to help you
Yes.
educate, but your strategy needs to be your own. Um,
Yes. And that's exactly where I agree. Pulling in outsiders to help you ask the right questions, poke holes in strategy, or guide you. But yes, you're 100% right. It has to
yeah,
be your own. Otherwise, it's never going to be
right.
implemented. And it can be small. It can be easy. It doesn't have to be 100-page document. It could be 2 pages
Right.
or three
It
pages.
can be a
Start
memo,
someplace.
right?
Just start
All right. That's going
someplace.
to be my new campaign. Bring back the memo. Um, because memos don't sound intimidating. They're easy to write. Like bring back hey, just write
Do
me a
you?
memo on it. If you say write a
I
strategy,
remember
if
when
someone says, hey, David, write me a strategy, I'm going to say, all right, how many weeks do I have? If someone says write me a memo, I'll say, what time do you want it today?
exactly. The funny thing is, you remember years ago when you started out, every employee, at least I used to, every firm I worked at, I had my own corporate mailbox. You'd go over there and you get the
Yes.
daily set of memos
Yes.
that were delivered, and somebody would go around and deliver the memos, and invariably people would write the memo, they would mimeograph them. Mimeograph, for those that don't know, use pre
Yeah.
pre-copy days, pre-printed days, and they put them in your box, and every morning I get my list of memos for the day from whoever in the firm had it,
Yeah.
wrote a memo.
I literally had a discussion with someone who asked me sort of tongue in cheek, but why do we call it a mailbox when we're talking about email? And why do we call them folders when we're talking about the organizing devices for digital file systems? So I guess a lot of people don't remember the physical mail slot that you had to go pick up your announcements from. Yeah.
There was places, a whole generation of people, young obviously, who don't even know what a CD is. Never mind a mailbox or a folder or filing cabinets or
This
any
is
of that
true.
stuff. Or have even walked into a library.
Yes. Well, like I don't
Yes,
miss
we're
I don't
dating
miss my
ourselves.
microfilm days. I'll just say that for anyone who had to look up microfilm in university days. I do not miss going into the library and looking up microfilm.
No, 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 and no. I absolutely do not miss those days. They were
All right.
excruciatingly
Well, now that we've
painful.
firmly established ourselves as modern dinosaurs, let's do one other quick question from the chat, and then we'll wrap up. Um, So the question is, do you
Yeah.
guys have any insights on open source versus closed source GPT models? I realize it's an open-ended question without a use case, but curious to understand how you think about the trade-offs of that. Peter, this one's right up your alley. When you're thinking about open source versus closed source, what do you think about?
It depends on no, I think that's whoever asked that question, that's an awesome question. I think that's one that comes up in conversations with us quite often. And I go back to it really depends on the problem that you're trying to solve. In many cases, the foundational closed source models, the OpenAI, the Grok, the other ones, given that they've been trained on such an enormous corpus of information, are the way to go. But you have to trade off a number of other factors here. There are, how much are you going to use it? The cost of using it? Are you supporting, thousands of users, or or just a one-off? Whereas I think the open source models are highly relevant for domain specific problems
Yeah,
where you're fine tuning a model with your own internal data. And you don't need that broad corpus of information, most of which has absolutely nothing to do
right,
with the problem that you're trying to solve. So it becomes a series of, business trade-offs, but also business and costs and engineering trade-offs. And if you want high performance for a small language model, for a domain specific model, you're going to go with a smaller model because it's just naturally
right.
going to be faster, and less expensive than a bigger foundational models. And I've seen this, and you've seen this plenty of times, where companies get enamored by the large models, run a couple of test cases, and then think it's going to scale to a very large number of people. And when you plug in the cost, you realize you're rapidly into eight, nine figures
Yes.
very quickly.
Oh
And I'm
no.
not
No, I
exaggerating.
mean that's a key consideration. If you're using a model as a service, you will be paying by the drink forever. You're paying by the token, and that number of tokens
Right,
can increase. And it's I sort of
right,
cringed when I read an article about context rag, which is basically um, jamming everything into the huge
right,
context windows that models have, because those huge context windows can cost you a lot of tokens and processing. So I think the economics
right,
of it are a huge point. As you said, the more domain specific the knowledge you need, the more that argues for not just using an
right,
open or a closed source model. Or, maybe you use a distilled small model
right,
or a fine-tuned model or something else. Um, I think
right,
the other
right,
thing, and this is maybe a little bit harder to quantify, but is, there's a distinction between open source and open weight models. Most of what we casually call the open source models are really just open weight. They're not open source
correct,
because we can't
right.
see everything that happened. We can't track every bit of data
No,
on which they were trained. And right,
no,
so there are a
no,
few open source models that are end-to-end transparent. Um, those aren't very large. They're
right,
comparatively not as powerful as other models, but there are going to be some situations that are so critical that you know exactly what that model has been trained on, that you may want a real open source model. Otherwise, you're probably looking at an open weight
right,
model where the training is still opaque, but you can modify the weights by fine tuning and retraining.
right, and make it
Yeah,
specific for your set of requirements. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, and this is true of a lot of systems, you lose a measure of control when you use the closed foundational models, because they're making changes to them fairly consistently. Maybe they're
yeah,
training them, adding information to them, whatever it may be. And you know what? For a problem that you have, that might be exactly what you don't want. You want absolute control of what's in that
yeah,
model, and you don't need to train it every 5 minutes. You need to be able to control what's in there. So you're going to fine tune, one of the open weight models, and maintain the control
yeah.
that you need for your
I
business
made a
model.
video about that back in, I think it was maybe December or January, that I talked about AI lobotomies, and there have been real cases where people have,
Yes.
had
Yep.
the foundational model they were using changed while they were, while they were using it, and
Right.
suddenly it forgot or changed its behavior. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a real issue.
That's a problem.
Um, hey, we've
Yeah.
as the do you ever watch Car Talk, Click and Clack, the Tappert brothers on NPR, or listen to them,
Oh my
right?
God. Yes. Of course I used to. It's been
Yeah.
a long time. I
Their
used to love
closing was
that.
always something like, "Well, you've
I
wasted
forgot
another
about that
perfectly
show.
good hour." Um, I hope no one, yeah, I
Yeah,
hope
those
no one
guys are
feels like
great.
they've wasted a perfectly good hour. But we have used up almost an hour, so I guess we should start to wrap up
I
this
know.
this session today.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure going through this with you, and the questions are great. Please keep them coming. I think it makes it more
Yeah,
interesting and more relevant for everybody. Dave and I try to make these interesting. We try to keep them, not boring. I don't want to be boring. I don't want anybody to say, "Oh, that's a boring podcast." I like them to be exciting and, um, it's fun.
And if anyone thinks Peter needs to up his shirt game, just put that in the comments on LinkedIn as well.
I
Just kidding.
I 100%. I 100% up my shirt game. I mean, look at it, boring blue. Come on, how do I compete with that?
Surfboards, man.
I can't compete with that. I told you to up my game. The board shirt. Come on, it's something
So,
better.
uh,
Yeah, so we didn't comment that on the beginning. I
yeah.
should have started with that.
Yes. So, thank you for all the questions in chat, and I really appreciate that, Peter. It's always fun to talk with you about this stuff, and nice for us to get a
Yep.
chance to sort of freewheel on these things. And it's always interesting to
Yes.
explore what are the common threads, and where, with our slightly different backgrounds, where do we have different viewpoints on things. Um, and
Right.
as always, there's never a single right answer, but hopefully we can shed some light on
No.
things and at least make people aware of some of the things they should be thinking about.
Yeah, and I hope that's
Yeah.
what we try to do is David and I. We've spoken to a lot of people. We've seen a lot of different things, and impart some of that knowledge. And like you said, very often there's not a right answer. There's a lot of
Right.
answers, and it just depends. There's a variety of variables that we factor into a lot of things, and but at least give you some points from which to when you're doing this yourself, say, hey, you know what? I think at least I'm
Right.
thinking about that.
All right. Well, till
So,
next week, thank you. And thank you everyone for watching and joining and commenting. And Peter, I'll talk to you soon.
yes. Dave, I'll talk to you soon. Everybody have a great
All
day.
right.
Thank you
Take care,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye bye.